States once segregated individuals by race. We abhor that. We see no reason why it should be any different when it is communal pressures and systemic racism that does the same. We believe that individuals separated can never be equal, and that's why we will break up ethnic enclaves. What are enclaves? They are insular areas where particular ethnic groups congregate. They frequently become ghettos due to discrimination and economic alienation. Examples include Black Bottom Enclave in Detroit, where 12,000 African Americans live in crumbling city blocks. What is our model? First, states should actively break up enclaves by buying back properties and offering compelling financial compensation. Generally, people will be quite willing to accept these incentives. Former enclave residents will be granted housing elsewhere at the state's expense. Schools in the new area should offer their ethnic language as a second language. The income level of these new districts should also be equal to or above the national median. Of course, families will be kept together and given subsidies for housing and employment. This model is a track record of success in Louisville, Kentucky, where the city administration went through with plans to rehouse ethnic migrants. Today, 2/3 of former enclave residents have lifted themselves out of poverty. We're going to forward 3 arguments. First, that we combat discrimination. Secondly, that we empower migrants. And my second speaker will be talking to you about disarming political extremism. Yes?
What if these people refuse to leave? What will you do then?
We think that if these people refuse to leave, the state can compel them to buy back these properties and as a consequence compensate them for the required amount. But as I will show, most of these people, generally speaking, are quite willing to leave these enclaves. Moving on to my first argument, that we combat discrimination. The thrust of this argument is that the desegregation of immigrants frees them from a coerced choice, facilitating integration. Let's start from the premise that no one really wants to live in an enclave. Honestly, life in an enclave is undignifying and disempowering. In the Dorchester enclave, for Somali migrants in Boston, there are 14 shootings every week, and 1 in 4 people are unemployed. No one wants to raise a family in such deplorable conditions, particularly migrants who come in search of a better life. That's why, for instance, in Bangladesh, the 8,000 Hindu migrants in the Dasha Shara enclave have formed advocacy groups to campaign for governments to rehouse them. The same is true for enclaves such as Milgolin in Germany, Tellerborg in South Africa, and Adoni in Hungary, where residents form groups to campaign for governments to help them seek a better life elsewhere. Generally, immigrants only live in enclaves because they are trapped by hostile societies, because landowners engage in price discrimination to make houses unaffordable for minorities they don't like, because neighbors behave in a hostile manner to migrants, hoping to drive them back into enclaves. Critically, these attitudes are a direct product of the enclave's existence, because racist majorities know that this is a convenient location they can funnel migrants to if they treat them badly enough. Over time, migrants believe this is their only place in the social order. Therefore, enclaves perpetuate their own existence. Hence, enclaves form not because the average migrant wants to be segregated, but because racist majorities refuse to tear down walls. We think governments have a duty to free people from the false choice that is living in an enclave. Moreover, enclaves perpetuate massive harms to a minority group as a whole, giving governments a further reason to intervene. What are these harms? The existence of enclaves ossify degrading social stereotypes because they physically separate migrants from the rest of society. This encourages dishonest caricatures, which cannot be corrected since migrants remain invisible. That's why 3/4 of Parisians consider Arab migrants living in suburban enclaves the primary cause of crime, resulting in the passage of laws that allow police to invade privacy in these enclaves. In fact, enclaves fuel the perception that minorities are deliberately insular by refusing to interact with the rest of society. These perceptions restrict the freedom and liberties of migrants. They have limited empowerment as they are considered potential criminals. They can't send their children to school in majority neighborhoods because they might be subject to bullying. In fact, migrants are sometimes subject to acts of microaggression or hate crime due to these stereotypes. Therefore, enclaves create damaging stereotypes. Why are we better? Because we allow immigrants, who generally in most cases want to leave enclaves, the ability to do so via subsidies. This means that different racial groups live in close proximity, creating interaction. Communities see minorities as ordinary people, just like themselves, walking children to school, going to work, or relaxing in the park. It is much harder to vilify someone when he is no longer invisible. We don't deny that there will be initial distrust, but this will happen on both sides. At least we create the conditions for integration and future acceptance. Therefore, we allow people to break out of harmful stereotypes. Yes?
If outside life is so hostile and racist, isn't it reasonable for these
We think that outside life will improve once people in this enclave, when people in the outside world know that they can't just funnel minorities back into enclaves, which they see as their rightful place in the world. The thing is, enclaves perpetuate their own existence by giving majorities a convenient place to funnel migrants. On our side, we create the conditions for future acceptance. That's why we're better. Our second argument is that we empower migrants. I'll be proving to you that active integration creates opportunities for migrants to access more equitable treatment. 3 reasons why enclaves make it harder for migrants to receive dignified treatment. First of all, it makes them vulnerable to discriminatory state policies. When migrants live in a single geographical area, governments, swayed by discriminatory voters, find it easier to implement sweeping policies such as underfunding amenities, schools, and public transport. For example, education funding was cut in the Cartagena enclave in Budapest, so 2 state schools cater to 1,700 children, and only 53% of them graduate. In Detroit, city administrators ensure that only 2 bus services run through Black Bottom enclave every 3 hours, so residents find it incredibly hard to find jobs elsewhere. Outside is better because minorities live alongside majority populations. Politicians cannot implement sweeping, area-wide discriminatory policies in the same fashion. The second reason why enclaves are bad is because they allow retailers to exploit residents by capitalizing on their reduced mobility. Enterprises, like department stores, charge exorbitant prices because managers know that enclave residents are less mobile, they can't find stores elsewhere because public transport is deficient and they often don't own private transport. That's why in Little Haiti in Miami, CVS Pharmacy sells paracetamol at a 240% markup. We are better because without enclaves, companies can no longer charge these discriminatory higher prices. The third reason why enclaves are terrible for migrants is because they harm their employment prospects. Offices and workshops don't establish themselves in these areas because managers perceive enclaves to either be unsafe or think that residents have disparities in language skills that don't make them employable. On our side, we remove enclaves by separating them. As a consequence, immigrants and minorities will be better able to integrate and make themselves employable. They can achieve language skills because they are no longer in underfunded schools, because they interact with members of the majority on a daily basis. For example, in Ontario, the employment rates of Caribbean migrants increased by 2/3 after the city government imposed racial quotas in state-subsidized housing. Therefore, breaking up enclaves is in fact necessary as a first step to uplift the immigrants living within them. We must act as a government in principle, because the days of separate but equal should never again be allowed to dominate ethnic discourse.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 3 seconds.
I thank the first proposition speaker for his speech, and now to open the case for opposition, I call on Francis Ho.
I think that'll be fine.
Increasingly, enclaves provide a sense of inclusion and belonging that is vital for any minority group. From the Punjabis in Vancouver to the Little Havana community in Miami, We believe that enclaves provide a community that understands and supports immigrants without judgment. So what do we support coming from side opposition? We support initiatives that empower the members of these communities at the end of the day. Firstly, we support subsidizing local businesses. We support creating incentives for anyone who wants to enter and do business in these enclaves. And we support building mainstream structures in these communities and using existing subsidies to do all these things. Such as, for instance, we want to build schools that teach in Spanish and create racially diverse police forces and more. So our clash coming from opposition is quite simple, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that actively breaking up ethnic enclaves will do more harm than good to the populace of these communities. I have two arguments to support this for you today. My first is about how you end up igniting racial tensions on their side of the house and how people are better off economically on our side of the house. Before I move on to my substantives, let's move on to my several points of rebuttal to the case made by the previous speaker. Because this is what their model actually is, ladies and gentlemen. They told us that states are going to give financial incentives to these minorities so that they can move out. Our first response to this is, will these financial incentives really work? They haven't really proven why they're going to choose these financial incentives over their culture and over their community. But even if, we think it's already a coerced choice coming from their side of the house. Their characterization betrays them, ladies and gentlemen, when they told us that these people are poor. We think it's because of that, it is very likely now that these choices are actually coerced coming from their side. Next, they tell us that, ironically, they tell us that you actually have a coerced choice on the part of these people because they are trapped in these poor enclaves and they can't essentially leave. We tell you that, first of all, they always have the choice to leave, ladies and gentlemen. They haven't really proven why this choice is absolutely coerced. But we think that these immigrants are happy to remain inside these enclaves because they preserve their ethnic identity and their support system at the end of the day. I'll be talking to you about that in my arguments. Next, they told us the idea of encouraging stereotypes, like telling people that they're going to be potential criminals, and how these perceptions actually limit immigrants and people will be hostile. Ladies and gentlemen, that won't help on their side of the house, because if people are as discriminatory and as racist as they say, how is that going to help when you integrate these minorities into a racist system? We think it's very likely for you to now further ignite racial tensions. Actually, I'll be arguing that later on as a response to their argument. Lastly, and very quickly, they told us the idea of opportunities for migrants. We think they're more of an absolute minority on their side of the house. It's harder for them to actually fight oppressive policies coming from the state and coming from the rest of society. My second speaker will be arguing about how you get better treatment through the establishment of critical mass. Before I move on to my arguments, yes, sir.
Would you have desegregated schools in the USA when racial tensions were even worse than they are presently?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat that?
Would you have desegregated schools in the USA when black and white children were schooled separately and racial tensions were even worse than they are presently?
Thank you for the point of information. Because coming from him, he told us that they actually have segregation in the status quo. But we think that for ethnic enclaves, it is actually quite different because these individuals have already found support systems inside their communities. Let's move on to my first argument about how you increase racial tensions coming from their side of the house. Because as it stands, people in dominant culture already think that immigrants are stealing their jobs and invading their country, especially right-leaning individuals. On the other hand, some immigrants are already starting to worry. They worry about their safety, that they're going to get kicked out of their country or even physically attacked, that their culture will be erased. Because France, for example, is already banning the wearing of the hijab in public. So there are some elements in both sides that actually exploit these fears that already exist in the status quo. Like for instance, you have far-right parties in Italy, Germany, and France, and you even have Donald Trump as the Republican frontrunner. And even in the members of these ethnic and religious minorities, it's very likely for them now to support the use of violence against these dominant cultures. So therefore, you have both groups preying on the fears and insecurities of society in the status quo. But when you break up enclaves, you actually fuel the rhetoric of both groups. For right-wing groups, you're going to allow them to spread fear about how immigrants will steal jobs flood their schools, and threaten dominant
Point of
values.
information,
Because
Madam.
now you are forcing them into the mainstream society. As for extremists, they're going to use this to encourage members of their community to resort to violent means to justify and to actually defend their culture that they feel is being attacked. So even if their methods are soft, like housing policies and financial incentives, we still think that these ethnic minorities will see it as an imposition because of the historical experiences of minorities with Western society. We think that these people will actually see it as conquest and assimilation, as an attempt to divide and conquer. So we think that you actually ignite racial tensions coming from their side of the house. Next argument, about how they are better off
Point of
economically
information.
on our side of the house. No, thank you, sir. Because what are you essentially outside your enclave? You're going to be working and living a minimum wage, and we think that is true in the general majority of cases. We think that it's very hard for you to gain social mobility because of linguistic and structural barriers, ladies and gentlemen, because you don't have connections and you don't know anyone who can help you move up. But inside your enclave, there's a higher need for specialized skills. There's acupuncture, like selling herbal medicine, for instance, so that you can learn these skills and work inside these businesses. You can even start your own business if you want to, ladies and gentlemen, because it is easier for you to access capital inside your community. You have many large businesses right now already starting as community businesses, like KFC. They have some community support at first, and this led them to their path to success. And we think that this is a potential trap for enclave businesses as well. We think that there are cultural practices inside these communities that actually make it easier for them to access capital, like borrowing informally, for instance, like so-called Islamic banks that loan without interest, and you have investors in whatever you borrow. You also have microfinance, and you even have the Korean model of rotating credit. So when you have specific financial models and practices used inside these enclaves, you have a sense of trust in these people that does not exist outside of these enclaves because people generally dislike them. So you already have culturally linked services, but we think that they're equally legitimate under our model. And we think that we have to look at the example of ethnoburgs, right? We think it is a term coined by Harvard in the study of enclaves. We agree that these enclaves are poor at first, but we don't think that they remain poor. When you have suburbs forming around these enclaves, it is a sign that rich people and middle-class people are actually existing right now. Because as I've proven to you earlier, enclaves are becoming a hotbed of economic activity, and therefore, you are then able to have social mobility under our model. Because now these rich immigrants are moving around the enclave and actually forming areas within that. So that means that they're contributing and also stimulating the economy under our model. Like for instance, when you have the 86,000 Chinese people living around Chinatown. What does this indicate? This means that number one, it is not a trap, and that number two, these enclaves actually get richer over time, which debunks their characterization of poverty. And we think that cultural ties are still quite important to these minorities. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 24 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for her speech. And now to continue the case for proposition, I call upon Brian Ian.
The opposition's case came dangerously close to supporting segregation, but they're never willing to explicitly say so. Just listen to their language. We want communities that understand each other without judgment, but only when you're inside. You can find support structures only inside your community. You see, this was exactly what the whites said in the past before schools were desegregated. You can find your own support structures back in your school. You can find your own support structures back at home. The problem is, at some point we realize the support structures should not be bound by your race. Support structures should not be bound by the ethnicity you were born into. We want to create support structures that transcends racial boundaries, and that is why the only way to do this is to support team proposition. I'm going to look at two key areas in this debate. First, I'm going to ask if these individuals actually chose to be in ethnic enclaves. Note, they refused to deal with most of my first speakers' material as to why they did not choose to live there. If we can prove sufficiently that this choice does not exist, well, thank you ma'am, then it is legitimate for us to take away this coercive choice. Second question I'm going to ask is whether we help enclaves and help individuals in enclaves or not. But before that, there seems to be some confusion with our policy as to financial incentives. Okay, so if some individuals, the minority probably don't want their house bought back, we believe that we can still have compulsory buyback policies. We believe that is part and parcel of the motion. Moving on, is this choice a coerced choice or not? Here is where the refusal to deal with my first speaker's material was particularly dangerous, because we gave you 5 reasons why it was a coercive choice but heard no response to any of them. First reason, enclaves are self-reinforcing. So we admit perhaps the first few immigrants who entered in these areas may have had a free choice. But the problem is, at the point in which you have a congregation of immigrants, it starts becoming more and more of an expectation for you to join that group when you enter into this country. Enclaves form themselves and go over time because of that influence. No, thank you, madam. Not because people want to be there. Second, it is somewhere to drive minorities. So it's very difficult for a majority to discriminate against a minority unless he knows he can drive them somewhere else. So, if I know an ethnic minority is living next to me, I can say, your rightful place should be the enclave, because I know I can drive him there, and that is what they claim where all their support structures lie. So, their own analysis belies the fact that discrimination is worsened at the point in which enclaves exist. It is not a free choice. Third, we brought you the idea of learner helplessness. At the point in which people start to accept and internalize the fact that enclaves are where their support structures are, then it becomes very difficult for them to break the perception that I could possibly form support structures elsewhere. That is why their own concession that support structures exist inside enclaves is what perpetuates learner helplessness. Fourth, there is a collective action problem. If they do admit that hostility exists sometimes outside, it's very difficult for individuals to take the first step out. Very often we need government action to correct collective action problems. Fifth, the next generation of migrants often do not choose. So a child who is born into an ethnic enclave did not say, I wanted to be born in an ethnic enclave. So maybe the first generation migrants did choose, but you have to prove to us why for all the children who have to live in streets with no street lamps, who have to walk 2 hours to their school, hold a minute man, they deserve this. This is not a choice, we reject it. Go.
Are you implying that Muslim immigrants in Europe are liable for the xenophobic attitudes of the rest of society?
No, they're not liable. Your side is. Because when you force them into an enclave and you refuse to give them a solution to the coerced choice that they did not consent to, that is when you are liable for discrimination against these enclaves. That is your POI to answer, not mine. Second question, who best helps ethnic minorities? First, they talk about hostility. Here's where neglecting my first speaker's dynamic analysis was particularly harmful to their case. Because we are rather new ones, we did not say hostility exists whether or not an enclave exists. We say hostility exists at the point in which everyone congregates in an enclave and this hostility perpetuates itself. Our analysis is very simple. When people know they can drive you there, when people know that they can enact policies and centralize it in this area, that is when hostility is created. But let's accept it at the best case scenario. Even in the worst cases, we suggest that even if hostility exists, they allow decentralization of hostility. That is why we see Pegida marches right through ethnic enclaves, because they know they can discriminate against every single minority at the same time, at the point at which you congregate them and push them into one small space. We talked about policies that can be enacted against this small ethnic group. They had no response, they only tried to carry out this out by having a nice little policy. But you see, this doesn't work. Opposition doesn't have fiat to enact every single thing they want to. Very often the political voice is missing for individuals to even change anything. So at the point at which they allow the centralization of hostility, this is bad. The last idea, businesses. Well, thank you, madam. So, they want people to always work in acupuncture over time, to work in culturally related jobs. We suggest we give them an alternative as to what to work to. If you want to work in acupuncture after we move you to a new house, sure, go ahead. But many enclave members do want to work in other places. You know why they can't? Because buses don't come for them to take the bus to their job. We move them to a new place, we cannot enact specific discriminatory policies. That is when we can give them access to wider jobs. No, thank you, madam. Last, is that rich immigrants are a good example of ethnic enclaves being successful? No, they are an example of gentrification. They are an example of rich people starting to live around enclaves and often causing the outpricing of enclaves. That is why we see in pharmacies around ethnic enclaves, paracetamol is so expensive because the rich immigrants living there want to outprice the members of the ethnic enclave. A harm we told you in first speaker, we got no response. I'm going to move on to my substantive argument today and show you why we disarm political extremism. And this is particularly important because it removes all the mechanisms their policy wants to enact. At the point in which this is true, then they must accept that ethnic enclaves become a hotbed for crime or a hotbed for very terrible situations. So, how do we disarm political extremism? You see, ethnic enclaves provide easy targets for political rhetoric. They provide very easy anchor points and images for people to associate things like crime, like poverty, with even in their first speaker's speech already implicitly implying this. So, that is when parties like the Jobbik Party, or very often right-wing parties, can use this sort of language to anchor their political stances. Why is this right-wing political stance harmful? For starters, it fuels stereotypes. Using ethnic minorities as targets to forward right-wing agenda, no thank you, allows politicians to play into stereotypes like a biological tendency toward crime, or the backward nature of minority cultures. Since very often minorities have a diminished political voice, it is very difficult to change this. But what makes this worse, thank you, is that stereotypes create space for xenophobic policies. As voters tend toward these stereotypes, they're likely to buy into the rhetoric that the cause of social problems are ethnic minorities. So they may support a range of things, like a significant limitation to immigration, reduced developments of services like schools and hospitals in the area, or more insidious policies, like the militarization of the police, as well as stop and frisk policies around the area. In Macedonia, the targeting and vilifying of ethnic enclaves, Albanian enclaves particularly, has since seen the VMRO gain close to half the seats in parliament, consistently implementing nationalistic and often anti-immigrant policies. So, not only does their policy not work, they create a hotbed for politicians to vilify these ethnic enclaves and create policies that harm these ethnic minorities. Even if right-wing parties don't get into power, very often they shift the political spectrum. That is why in the UK, the recent UK election, every single party had immigration reform on its agenda because of the rise of right-wing concerns. So it might have been, maybe right-wing policies won't be in power now, or in the long term, at the point at which you legitimize these attitudes, that is when the harms are caused. We protect the most vulnerable, we free them from a coerced choice, we stand proud on T proposition.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
I thank the second proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for opposition, I call upon Abigail Lee.
Hello? What will life be like for immigrants outside of enclaves, ladies and gentlemen? Imagine working for inherently exploitative jobs under zero-hour contracts, where your children are trapped in low-tier classes because English isn't their first language, or when bad things happen and they're forced to be defended by public lawyers who don't speak their mother tongue. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the world of side proposition is actually much, much worse for these immigrants. I have two arguments in my speech. The first of which is how our side actually allows enclaves to form a support system based on their shared culture. And secondly, I'll talk about how breaking up enclaves reduces the political and collective bargaining power of immigrants. Before that, I have several levels of rebuttal. The first thing was a problem with basically their solution or their model, right? Why is it exactly their solution to break up enclaves in order to solve all of their problems? How exactly does that make life easier for these immigrants outside, right? So, alright, they might have houses, right? But will they have good paying jobs? Will they actually get protected by the state, especially if they are even more of a minority outside of their enclave? We think it's even worse on their side. Because what happens really as to why immigrants choose to enter into enclaves is because outside those enclaves, they are inherently disadvantaged in the job market. They are competing against people who have had years to build up connections and experience, while these people are new to that country. That is why they form an enclaves, right? Because there are unique economic opportunities within those places that my partner talked about. The first thing he said was that remaining in enclaves is a coerced choice. No, thank you, sir. Don't we think it's even more of a coerced choice on their side when they actually compel people to leave the enclave, even if these people don't want to leave the enclave? If your problem is that life is difficult for people outside the enclave, then why don't you just, for people who actually do want to leave the enclave, give access to things like welfare and social services? Why is there a need to actively break up these enclaves? There was no response coming from them. And then he talked about a racist majority. And somehow, his second speaker says that despite this racist majority, we will rely on this majority to give us our support systems. Where exactly is the link? They've never given it to us on their side of the house. Rather, we contend that interaction is likely to be negative, especially because their policy is so invasive. You are forcefully assimilating these people into society, even if society doesn't want to, and even if these minorities don't want to. Versus in our side, what we do is we allow for these people to willingly enter into these enclaves and interact with the minority there. Note that inside an enclave, the minority is not a minority, but the majority within that enclave, right? In fact, what happens is, in our side, you allow for the majority to come in and willingly and positively interact. Anyway, right? You've seen that in tourism. What happens is, this is less likely when you have such an invasive policy on their side of the house. Before I move on, yes.
How are enclaves a safe space when they are hotbeds of crime and painted targets for discriminatory action?
Exactly, sir. So if your problem is that these enclaves are hotbeds of crime and incredibly poor, then don't break up these enclaves. Rather, pour money to improve the quality of life within these enclaves, to invest in improving your social services, invest in improving your police force. That is not going to happen in their side of the house. And then they talked about more opportunities. No, thank you, sir. How these people are vulnerable to racist policies and how it's easy to target them when they're all together. I have an argument about this later on, so I'll be responding to that argument in terms of increasing collective bargaining power. And then the second speaker, lastly, talked about the idea of disarming political extremism. The idea of labeling these communities as hotbeds of crime and poverty. To which we say no. If you think about it, most extremists are actually individuals who are pushed to a corner, who are victims of racist majorities. And they have no support system to turn to, right? They have no, thank you, sir. In fact, what enclaves tend to do is that they checks and balance people who tend to go extreme. Because people, the majority of people in the enclaves don't want to be labeled as extremists. That's why most Muslim communities rejected the ISIS, right? So in terms of preventing extremism, it actually happens in our side of the house. Let's move on to the argument on forming a support system based on culture. No, thank you. There's a reason why immigrants actively seek out enclaves, right? They try to latch on to aspects of their culture and their home, to find somewhere where they belong and to experience a sense of community. We characterize these people as people who share culture, history, religion, or even languages, right? In some cases, they share a history of oppression, like immigrant populations with a high number of refugees, like the Jews after World War II, or the Cubans in Miami. What this means is that the environment in enclaves is just more conducive to be able to practice your culture when you're not seen as other or different or second class, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, it is easier to build places of worship like synagogues and mosques or schools that teach in the dominant language and in the mother tongue, right? And to practice cultural holidays and festivals, which tend to be communal as well. But this is unlikely to happen if there are too few of them in other communities. It is harder to gather resources or support to make these things happen because there is no critical mass for people to demand it. Imagine having to travel long distances just to access like religious facilities, to pray, ladies and gentlemen, or when a woman gets dirty stares for wearing a hijab in France. This is psychological torture. By coming to a new state, they did not give up the right to keep their culture. In fact, citizens don't have to give up the right to culture to continue living if they're in the majority. So why is there a burden on the minority to do that? They've never answered that. All right. No, thank you, sir. Let's talk about how breaking up enclaves actually reduces political power and bargaining power of these immigrants. And this is indirect rebuttal to all the things they talked about in terms of racial, discriminatory policy. The root of that basically is critical mass and proximity, right? When ethnically homogeneous members live close to one another and the majority of them have similar experiences and are more likely to face similar issues such as immigration rights and discrimination. The proximity within one another in enclaves makes it logistically easier for them to organize and reduces the cost of people participating versus in their side when people from different states have to fly in just to organize or to join a protest. Moreover, you have a greater level of investment in your community. When you see one of the people in your neighborhood, for instance, experience discrimination, you're more likely to want to organize because you are invested in your community and you care about the people in that community. That leads to things like more neighborhood watch groups, right? And it leads to greater lobbying power in general when these people were able to organize, as what we have seen in Little Havana, which resulted to the bill on basically the police being able to act as immigration officers no longer being passed. At the end of the day, underneath the language of side proposition, what they're really doing is not just breaking up enclaves, but breaking apart homes, cultures, identities, and support systems. The last line of defense against a hostile and discriminatory world. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for proposition, I call upon Ernest Goh.
They've missed our case. Every time we told them about problems of systemic racism, they said, oh, you can see, if majorities are racist, why expose immigrants to them? But if they've been listening very carefully, Right from the beginning of this debate, we told you that the very reason majorities are racist in the first place is enclaves. That was what my first speaker meant when he told you that enclaves perpetuate themselves. No analysis at all as to how they will combat these racist perceptions, considering that they do exist in reality. Consequently, I have two questions. One, why do immigrants form enclaves in the first place? Second, do they benefit when they leave? First, on enclaves. Right from the beginning of this debate, we identified immigrants as a very specific group with very specific purposes. We said they leave often in search of economic opportunity. Funny then, isn't it, that they don't end up in bustling city centres where they're the most jobs, but in areas of economic alienation. We said they leave often in search of a better future for their children. Isn't it bizarre that they don't go to the best schools, but in an area where the school doesn't teach their mother tongue, is underfunded and has bad policing, so that crime is rampant. So we said it's bizarre for them to claim that people make an active choice to want to stay in an area that is so bad and directly anathema to the purpose as why they came in the first place. No, thank you. So what were the reasons they actually ended up in enclaves? Reasons we gave you from our first speaker: absolutely no response from team opposition. We told you, given you track records of examples as to how immigrants in Bangladesh, in South Africa, in Germany, all campaigned for their governments to let them leave. But they never responded to these examples because they had no reason and no response as to how. What were the reasons we gave you? One, we told you about systemic racism, and we told you that there exists a perverse, self-reinforcing cycle at work here. Enclaves perpetuate racism, and racism in turn drives immigrants into, you guessed it, enclaves. No, thank you. We said when immigrants are invisible, it becomes easy to caricaturize them and make them seem as if they are criminals who we should fear. No response. We said enclaves encourage racism because majorities know that if I'm sufficiently unkind to this person, he'll have to go somewhere else, the enclave. So I always have a perverse incentive to be as unkind to him as possible. Again, no response. We want responses to all these arguments in that first speaker, but otherwise it will still be too late. We told you further that this is also a condition that builds up over time. We told you about learned helplessness. How sometimes immigrants, unfortunately, are conditioned to believe that this is all they deserve, that this is their place in the social hierarchy. And that's why when they tell us, we'll just incentivize those who want to leave to go. We have a number of responses. First, due to this reason, they can't because they've been conditioned to believe that this is what they want. When this debate should be about whether or not we can give them a life that's better. So that doesn't work. But furthermore, let's think about this argument. If you want to make a policy shift in a second and say that we're going to incentivize people who want to leave. Let's think about how their arguments are impacted. The vast majority of people who they consider are poor will rise to this economic incentive because they want to have this money. So they will leave. What happens to the support structures that you told us are so important? What about all the other people who chose to leave, to stay for cultural reasons? They don't have much support structures in those cases. So I suspect you've just considered half of your case. No, thank you. You can't be insincere, believe in principle that we should break up enclaves, but not have the courage to do so properly. Finally, we told you that exists a collective action problem at work here. Sometimes communal pressures compel individuals to stay because if they leave, they're seen as traitors of their culture. So individuals actually do want to leave, but they don't then do it themselves. So they need the state to do it on their behalf. Again, no response. We want answers to all these arguments, otherwise they have to lose this debate. Finally, we said, even if we can see everything, even if we lose every single point to second-generation immigrants and their children choose to grow up in areas of economic desolation, again, no response. So as my second speaker told you, there are 5 systemic reasons why this is not a false choice, and why all we are doing is not breaking up homes, but giving them new areas to live in. That's our response to all the arguments. But the only real reason they had to give us was, it's a legitimate choice. They need the support structure. Our first response is, come on. The average immigrant doesn't want to only have friends in those areas. Many times, it's not as if the average migrant says, I don't want to be friends with French people, I only want to be friends with people of the same color as I am. It's exactly because they tell us that they're defined as a history of oppression that they don't want to be defined that way. They want to interact with people outside that race so that they can move past those atrocities. Often they exactly want, to be friends with other people. They deny them this opportunity. So if they want support structures, I would submit that a support structure is more meaningful if you are friends with people of different races and diverse communities. Yes?
You said you want to break up poor enclaves. Will you also break up rich enclaves, areas of economic progress like the Jews in Manhattan?
Well, yes, because there are often stereotypes as devils who cling on to money as well. So I would submit that even if you are rich, you can still be disempowered. And that's our response to you. We'll still break up those areas because they're still disempowered. Back to my argument. They told us about support structures as well. But next, we're also going to suggest that support structures can still exist because they're not so much geographical or relational. And when we empower them economically, they still have the finances to meet up every once in a while to maintain their culture. But all this can only happen with individuals with the jobs they need to travel across borders and do what they need to do this as well. Finally, They told us that, well, none of this works because there exist language barriers between lawyers, how now there exist zero-hour contracts that are exploitative. Honestly, if their policy can declare by fiat that we have huge subsidies, we'll do the same things with school lawyers and the languages. We might well ban zero-hour contracts as we defended earlier this tournament, so we're quite happy to do so. So if their policy works, our side can do this as well, evaluate all the non-existent harms that they've claimed are existent. Second question, therefore, do they benefit from leaving? Here are 4 reasons they do. First, because of discriminatory state services that no longer hold true. We told you that this means underfunded hospitals, no response. We said this means bosses that trap them in because they come so infrequently, no response. This can't happen when we have mixed-race communities because many are public goods, no response. Then no, a lot of their arguments rely on policy measures, like their second biggest constructive about building religious sites, like their second biggest constructive about how now we have lobbying power. So let's break this analysis once and for all. If we prove that immigrants don't have lobbying power or political power, a lot of their case falls. Why is this false? Because first and foremost, even if they are a majority within their constituency, they're still a national minority. So this means that they have what? 1 or 2 seats in parliament. If you have political power without changing attendant xenophobic conceptions, all this invites is backlash. No thank you, because people perceive it as a political threat. This means that you'll be singled out for that kind of discriminatory policies. And you know what? We made this will happen on both sides of the house. But this is a little bit easier when you can single out an area that is exclusively immigrant in its population and target that area with brutal policing, target that area with an underfunded hospital. None of these problems exist on our team. And that's why our response to all this substantive argument about religious sites is it will just not be built either way. Because politicians actually lose votes when they cater to the minority. That's our response to the entire constructive argument on lobbying power and on religious sites. Second, because we combat racism better. We told you first and foremost, enclaves are the reason for racism because they provide an easy location for people to be funneled into and therefore the perverse incentive. And also because when immigrants are invisible, they're easily stereotyped, no response. We said the worst cases happen anyway. In fact, are even more easy to enact because now Pegida can identify the right place to hold their marches, no response. Finally, we said even if short-term cynicism exists, this debate is more than comparative. We still desegregated schools, even though there are short-term harms, and we sent in the National Guard to protect people in the interim. They wouldn't do this because they are so scared of the majority, they never want to break down these walls. That's unconscionable. Finally, they said, well, you can still go and see what life is like. The majority can go in. That sounds oddly to me like slum tourism, where the privileged majority goes in and say, well, let me see how life is like for this united minority. We want them to interact on equal terms, so they go back to the same house, not a crumbling block. That's our response. Finally, we told you about discriminatory corporate practices, how they can mark up paracetamol, no response. That's our third benefit. Fourth, we told you about social economic prospects, how now these are hotbeds of crime, and therefore how rich people don't want to congregate around the outskirts. And even if they do, how this just rises prices as well. So that wasn't even good, even if it were true. We told you about extremism and how, through no fault, they only do turn to that, even if they want to abhor the crime, because they feel that they are disempowered, and therefore, consequently, these perceptions still nevertheless foster. So these are 4 benefits that we gain that they don't have. They never touched our case, and that's why I'm so proud to stand by the principle that people separate can never be equal.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
I thank the third proposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for opposition, I call upon Jasmine Foley.
Separate but never equal. This is the rhetoric of Team Singapore. But the reality is that in the 1960s United States, segregation is just not analogous to their policy. Because it was a state that forcibly segregated these black and white students from one another. And that's why they created Brown versus Board of Education to correct that. But we think that when you have xenophobic attitudes already predisposed in your society, we think that your citizens, your immigrants, make a legitimate choice to stay in these communities precisely to protect themselves from those xenophobic and racist attitudes. I have 3 issues in my debate. First, did these individuals really choose to stay in those communities? Secondly, where are they better off? And third is deal with discrimination. And all 3 of these issues, it is Team Philippines that answers all of these problems. Alright, so let's go to the first topic of did they really choose it? And we think their own characterization betrays them. They're saying that immigration is the leading cause of xenophobia. Therefore, we should break these enclaves up to solve that xenophobia. But there's a logical inconsistency there. If I'm suddenly amiable to these immigrant communities when I see them, why wasn't I amiable to them before I saw them? It's likely you saw them in the media. You saw news of them entering your state. So why is it that suddenly something changes in the psyche of these racist individuals that makes them want to discuss and communicate with these individuals? We don't understand that logic, which means it is reasonable for these individuals to protect themselves by staying in these communities. We agree with the second speaker. We'd rather live in a world where you have support structures that aren't based on race. But the reality is that you need that particular sense of longing and attachment to people of the same ethnicity, because people of the other ethnicity constantly demonize you, discriminate you, and treat you like you're a second-class citizen. So in the instance that xenophobia persists, they are making a legitimate choice by staying in those community structures. My second speaker talked exclusively about this, and we never heard a coherent response by the previous speaker. He says, well, if outside life is as nice as you say, why did you decide to stay? Well, if you think about that, that's a pretty good reason. If outside life has so many job opportunities as you say it is, then perhaps there's a legitimate reason why they choose to stay behind. Maybe they think that the economic opportunities aren't as worse as the discrimination they will be experiencing once they leave those ethnic enclaves. So ultimately, we think they are making a legitimate choice. Ultimately, it's an arrogant perspective when they say that it is our burden of our immigrant communities to solve that xenophobia when we never created that problem to begin with. On to the second issue. Where are they economically better off? Yes.
Can you be the first person in your team to explain why it's conscionable for second-generation children to be birthed into, then locked into your enclaves?
They won't be locked into those enclaves. They can choose to leave only when they have developed that economic mobility to be equipped with the necessary skills to do so. And this is why my second issue is here. We talked about the existence of ethnoburbs. What are ethnoburbs, right? I don't think they understood what it means. It means that once your ethnic enclave has developed a level of economic mobility, there can be wealthy immigrants who decide to establish their own homes in the periphery of that enclave. And they just simply said that's gentrification. That's not gentrification, ladies and gentlemen, because your wealthy immigrants can help those poorer immigrants, if that characterization is even true, to begin with. Why? Because there's a consistent demand for their services. Not only for their specific cultural businesses as well, but also the nationalistic ties you have to those particular individuals. When you have greater income to purchase more of their goods, that's precisely how you can uplift poorer generations to go up by providing them with greater capital to establish new businesses, or even creating larger existing businesses by purchasing those services. And that's precisely how we think you help them. Secondly, we also brought up the idea from my first speaker when she was talking about the existence of unique community structures, such as microfinance, such as rotating credit systems. In Chinese systems, at the start of the 20th century, they required to have meetings every week, and they would donate $10 to $20 to be able to start that capital. And that repayment of those $20 was reinforced by social cohesion and possibly by the shame of being called out by the rest of your community. That kind of communication and transaction is not likely going to exist in a xenophobic society that they talked about from the very beginning. So likely, once you push them out of their enclaves, they're more likely to be disenfranchised because banks aren't willing to lend them, their neighbors aren't willing to lend them, and you're ultimately making them off in a worse economic position. We don't think that's fair whatsoever. And lastly, we also have to understand that even if they're poor now, let's concede, fine, by the characterization that they're poor now, that's such a short-sighted perspective. They won't be poor forever. The Jewish enclave started out as poor, but over 2 decades as they started to build capital, to build their industries, to be able to cultivate the economy by purchasing each other's goods, that's precisely how they became a wealthier society, so that their next generation of kin, so that the next wave of immigrants who decide to enter your state can be put into an economically better position. So your economic conditions are fluid, ladies and gentlemen. They are not stagnant compared to what the previous speaker thinks. But you disagree.
Do you think migrants should continue to live separate in enclaves forever?
No, we think there's a time when they come to stay. But if they do decide decide to stay there because of cultural ties, that's equally valid, ladies and gentlemen, and we don't think the state is in any position to make them scapegoats to solve xenophobia. And this is where I move very nicely into my third issue, where I talk about discrimination. Now, let's look at their model. They said, first of all, we can teach 2 languages in your new schools. All right, let's think of it this way.
Point
You
of
have
information, madam.
2,000 American students in your school, and you only have 100 Hispanic students. And now, under their model, they want to make those 2,000 American citizens learn the Spanish language as well. Personally, I would like to learn 2 languages, but knowing the psyche of kids, isn't it likely that they're going to be angry at these minority Hispanic students being forced to learn their language, being forced to spend time at school to do that? That is the kind of resentment they further breed under their model. And then the second speaker talked about how, well, they can decide to leave, it's just that there aren't any roads to get there. Look, they support subsidies as well. So if assuming that you have the same existing amount of funds, you can use that same amount of funds to be able to develop your structures inside these enclaves. This is what we talked about from the very beginning. But secondly, it's also less likely to be able to build these roads, these mosques, these synagogues, if they're absolute minorities in your different states. How expensive will that be? And then suddenly your taxpayers will think, why am I having to build a mosque or a synagogue for a person who's only a minority in my state? So it's discrimination, xenophobic attitudes that are further empowered under Proposition's model. But then let's talk about hotbeds of crime. These enclaves are full of criminals, rob gangs, ladies and gentlemen. Have you ever heard of white neo-Nazist individuals who also breed to a tendency crime in certain white communities? We're not actively breaking those, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's such an insulting and racist predisposition to say that those ethnic minorities are likely to breed crime. That's not true. And even if it were, perhaps it's the fault of your state by allowing these xenophobic attitudes to persist in the very beginning. Ultimately, we support grassroots organizations that can lobby for political reforms, that can change these xenophobic attitudes, that can empower the choices of your individuals. We are the equals ones in society. Team Singapore never addressed that. Thanks.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
I thank the third opposition speaker for her speech. We will now move on to the team's 4-minute concluding reply speeches. The opposition will deliver their reply speech first. There are no points of information during reply speeches. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know that they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, I call upon Abigail Yu.
Let's take a step back from this debate, because there were 2 main clashes, right? The first one is which side is able to protect the interests of these immigrants, and secondly, which side is able to achieve social change. The banner cry of side proposition was coerced choice. When right from the very start, if you listen to their policy, it is their side that actually coerces the choice of these people. In fact, it isn't even a coerced choice, it's a compelled choice. Because they said that if these people didn't want to leave their enclave, they're still going to force them anyway. So in terms of choice, don't you think that people actually have more choice on our side of the house? And then they came here and told us that the reason why it's a coerced choice is because they're always poor, right? To which we say, why exactly is poverty inherent in the idea of an enclave? That was something they never answered. We gave you so many examples of rich enclaves that they didn't really rebut. They promised they would, but they didn't really rebut or engage on their side of the house. And how exactly then does the quality of life of the people improve once they're forcefully assimilated into society? How do racist attitudes change? Sure, they told us there will be interaction, but did they explain to us how interaction is likely to be positive? No. Rather, they characterized interaction in favor for our side when they said that what exists is a racist majority. Who protects these immigrants on this debate? We think it's actually our side of the house. They said that these people are seen as a minority, right? And it's easier to oppress minorities because there are few of them. Isn't it actually worse on their side? Because these minorities become even more of a minority on their side of the house. What then do they do about the hostile majority? Nothing much. They never told us how they solve these racist perceptions on their side of the house. In terms of economic opportunities, the only solution they gave was housing, without really explaining what jobs these people will get, what quality of life or social economic mobility will happen on their side, while we gave you a host of economic opportunities that exist within enclaves, things like informal credit, right? Being able to borrow from your neighbor with no interest rates versus what? The banks and collateral on their side of the house, which by the way, white people don't like either. How is it going to be even better for these immigrants, especially for these minorities? It's actually our side that protects the interests of these immigrants. Lastly, on the flashpoint of social change, they said that these people are going to be stereotyped as criminals and as people who are poor. If that is the root of racism in stereotypes, that these enclaves are poor and hotbeds of crime, then why don't you just spend those housing subsidies to improve the quality of the institutions within these enclaves so that you can change these stereotypes? That was what we told you right from the very start. Why is the best solution to break up these enclaves at the expense of these people being pressured to release aspects of their culture, to no longer practice aspects of their culture, to become even more of an absolute minority when you lose out on collective bargaining power because there is no critical mass? They said that these people will always be minorities and they will never ever get things like legislation passed. It's worse on their side when they're even smaller minorities. At least what we have are grassroots organizations, the ability to form critical mass. At the end of the day, their only strategy, especially at WHIP, was to rebut us by saying that we did rebut. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was not engagement. They didn't talk about the idea of culture. They didn't talk about the idea of collective bargaining. Because of all these reasons, because it is our side that really protects the interests of these immigrants, the motion must fall.
Speakers spoke for 4 minutes and 18 seconds.
And now to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Brian Yen.
So by the end of this debate, opposition became particularly retreating and concessionary. By third, they were willing to say, enclaves are really bad, but at least people chose to live in enclaves. Let's look at the two worlds which were created at the end of this debate, and look at how minorities will feel within each of these worlds. Let's first look at the world of the opposition, where they claim our solution to interaction is, I like this, like tourism. So, majorities will walk into ethnic enclaves and say, look at those people doing acupuncture and their minority things, because after all, those are the only jobs minorities really want to work in. They are cultural related jobs. And you know what? Even if they don't have jobs, at the very least, I quote, they can borrow money from their neighbor. So that was their miraculous solution to economic empowerment. They said, no, now minorities can join a protest if they wanted to. This creates lobbying power. You know for who? For people who can say, look, those minorities are violent. Those minorities, even after we have given them citizenship, want some more. The problem is not with the money we have. It is the attitudes people have. And that is why at the point in which they say, Or we have the money for your housing subsidies, so we can use it to make these places better. They can't. Because everybody says, this is where minorities should be, we should not give them any more money, we have already given them enough. And the point in which enclaves creates hostility, creates discrimination, and creates segregation, that is when political will is lost, and they fuel right-wing rhetoric. They claim in a rather patronizing way that minorities need this support. But, it's not forever, but minorities always need this support. But someday they may eventually break up from the enclave. A little bit inconsistent, if you ask me. Or worse, they leave them without a choice. We give you 5 reasons, not really any responded to. 1, it reinforces itself. Often enclaves cause the racism and cause you to go without choice. Dynamic analysis missing in response. 2, people can drive minorities in at the point at which they can know I can do unkind things and they have a solution to find the support structures back there. 3, learned helplessness. Minorities believe that they should be there for collective action problems. No one wants to leave because they think that you'll be an environment of hostility. 5th and most importantly, the second generation of individuals. They say, they are economic empowerment. Okay, so you expect a child to wait for a bus which comes only every 3 hours to travel 2 hours to a city center. That is how you gain economic empowerment. Seriously guys, it doesn't happen that way. We tell you they were supporting segregation, but their only response was, segregation in the US was caused by the state and not by people. That is why the state sent National Guards in to protect minorities, because clearly the state was the one that created segregation. No, people were not the fault of discrimination. Don't be naive. The word of the opposition is one that segregates and one that compels segregation. Let's look at both the proposition, where we realize that immigrants come to seek a better life, and we maintain a balance between a newly created and diverse support structure and empowerment. But they seem to be concerned. They say, but politicians now won't build roads even then, so they can continue to discriminate against minorities. So I can say, every white guy can use this road. But no, you are a bad guy, so you can't use this road. It doesn't work that way, guys. At the point in which we can disperse individuals, that is when states cannot target specific groups with their policies. But more importantly, we humanize these individuals. They don't become invisibles we just talk about in ethnic enclaves. They don't become people who just walk around and, like tourists, watch them from afar. There are people we can talk to on a daily basis. People we can see coming to the same homes as us. That is why even the rich immigrants who are currently disempowered gain from living in a new home, living in a new environment, because they are humanized. We talk about price discrimination that we prevent, unemployment that we prevent, no response. What are we really doing when we break up ethnic enclaves? What we really do is to break free from the walls of segregation, break down the barriers to integration, break stereotypes and discrimination. That's why we stood firm on the basis that individuals separated can never be equal.